Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on how to do a systematic review. We are just going to wait a minute or so for people to join us. And in the meantime, we'll go through some housekeeping. So just to let you all know, the chat is open, so you can use it for sharing ideas, thoughts, and your experiences with others. But please use the Q&A function for questions. It just makes it a lot easier for us when we get to the Q&A session at the end to find your questions. And today's session is being recorded, and we'll send you the link to the recording after the webinar. So look out for an email from us with additional resources and the recording as well. So I think the numbers are starting to stabilize. So I think we can get started. So let's start. Let me start by saying a little bit about who we are. Sage Campus, in case you don't know, is a library resource created by Sage, offering a suite of online courses covering key skills and research methods across all stages of academic study. Our courses are developed by experts such as our speakers today, and are self-paced to suit learners with busy schedules. Our speakers today are Gemma, who you can see on the screen, I believe, and she is senior lecturer in clinical psychology at the University of Liverpool and an academic clinical psychologist who conducts basic and translational research at the interface between physical and mental health care, with a particular focus on oncology and evidence synthesis methodology. Michelle, who also contributed to this webinar but was unfortunately unable to join us today, is a lecturer in evidence synthesis at the University of Liverpool. She is a qualified information specialist and has over 20 years' experience of conducting systematic reviews and teaching evidence synthesis methods. Michelle and Gemma are co-author and forthcoming co-editor of the upcoming 4th edition of a systematic review textbook for students to guide them in completion of a systematic review as part of their studies, and have also developed 2 courses on the topic for Sage Campus. I think we are now ready to start, so I'll hand over to Gemma to start sharing her slides. Let me stop sharing mine. I think we can see it's still on PowerPoint, so you just need to, yeah.
With me a minute, we did practice this. Okay, let's try second time lucky. Can you see just the slides
Yes,
now?
there we
Perfect.
go. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I'm a bit nervous. I don't think I've ever presented to this many people, so please be kind to me. Like Pia said, my name is Gemma Cherry and I work at the University of Liverpool in England. It's lovely to see in the chat so many people joining from around the world, so thank you, particularly to people who have joined kind of out of social hours. So I'm going to be presenting today on behalf of myself and my colleague, Michelle, who's unfortunately unable to join for personal reasons today. And we're going to give a whistle-stop tour of how to do a systematic review. Time isn't going to allow us to go into as much detail as maybe we would do normally in a teaching session. So please do use the Q&A function if there are certain aspects that you'd like me to elaborate on at the end. And like Pia said, the webinar content is really closely aligned to our textbook. This is the latest edition, which was released in December 2023, and there will be a 4th edition coming within the next few years. There's also links here to both of our Sage Campus courses. The first focuses on how to define a review question and gather evidence. And the second focuses on what do you do when you have data, how do you synthesize it, how do you bring it together. So anyone that has already seen our textbook will be familiar with this 10-step guide. This is in the front of the latest edition of our book and breaks down the review process into 10 manageable steps. And the goal of today is to talk you through each of these steps and really give you an introduction to systematic review methods. So we'll start with the first step, which is really kind of if you want to do a systematic review or you're new to it, where do you start? How do you plan a review? And the obvious starting point is to explain to you what a systematic review is, because I imagine quite a few of you may be sitting here thinking, I've heard of them, I'm not really sure what they are. So we've pasted the Cochrane definition here. So the Cochrane collaboration defines systematic reviews as summaries of research evidence that address a clearly formulated question using systematic and explicit methodology to identify, select, and critically appraise relevant research and to collect and analyse data from the studies that are included in the review. So essentially, a systematic review is a transparent way of bringing together the findings of all available evidence relating to a specific research question, taking into account the quality or risk of bias of that evidence. And you'll see lots of different terms used in the literature. So you may see systematic review, you may see scoping review, you may see literature review. And people often ask what the difference is. So a systematic review always has a clearly defined and well-focused question. And we would recommend writing a protocol or a map of how you plan to address that question before you start your review. A systematic review follows explicit and rigorous methodology, and as part of that, contains an exhaustive and comprehensive and really explicit search for evidence. The criteria that a study would need to possess in order to be eligible for inclusion in a review should be explicitly stated, and conversely, for exclusion in a review. And the screening of search results and the selection of studies should be transparent, should be systematic, and ideally should involve at least 2 people to reduce bias. You should assess the quality of the evidence included in a review and systematically extract relevant data, bringing this together in a rigorous and predefined methodology. You should expect that this kind of review would be more time consuming than other reviews because of the rigour and the volume of the evidence that you may synthesise. But the important thing about a systematic review is that it is transparent and it's as free from bias as hopefully we can get. By contrast, scoping reviews and literature reviews often kind of aren't as rigorous in some or all of these steps. So scoping reviews are very broad, exploratory maps of what's known about a certain topic area, and usually don't involve quality assessment or as rigorous a process of selection. And literature reviews can vary in how comprehensive they are and to what extent they align with systematic principles across all of these different steps. So at this point, people will often think, well, do I need to do a systematic review? What kind of review should I do? And Write Review is a really useful website that asks you a series of questions. And the idea is that it will then give you some guidance about the most appropriate and explicit methodology to follow. So I ran through an example just before this webinar, and it's really helpful in terms of thinking about how much time you have available to you, what the goal of your synthesis or your review is, how familiar you are with research methods, who's on your team, whether you want to involve theory explicitly. And so it can be a really helpful starting point if you're thinking about doing a review, but you're not sure what type of review would be most appropriate. So I really like this graphic because it illustrates visually what a systematic review aims to do. So what you want to do is you want to kind of identify the issue, determine the question, and then cast your net wide, filter out irrelevant studies, irrelevant evidence, and then organise relevant data in a meaningful way that allows you to clearly address and answer the question that you set out to. So there are kind of 4 key steps or 4 key elements, activities involved in this. The first is the finding stage. So you want to identify relevant research. Then you want to describe it. So kind of what characteristics does the research addressing a certain question share? Then you want to critically appraise. So you want to kind of look more critically at the quality or at the risk of bias that the evidence is aligned to. And then finally, you want to bring together findings into a coherent statement that allows you to address the question that you set out to. And you'll see as we progress through the slides that we group the review activities according to whether they're finding, describing, appraising, synthesizing. This is likely quite small, but it's a really helpful toolkit. So it's a systematic review toolkit. And it's a really nice website that will allow you to identify tools. And by tools, I mean quality assessment tools, software, lots of different ways to help support the systematic review process. And as with the previous website, there are lots of filters that you can use to guide you as to what may be available to support you in the different steps of your review. So before you start, I'd encourage you to take a little look at this and see what's out there to help support each element of the review process so that you're starting sort of from a well-supported point of view. Okay. So before you start a systematic review, you need to perform scoping searches, identify your review question, and write your protocol. So scoping searches are really helpful. So scoping searches are preliminary literature searches that aren't usually as comprehensive as the main search for evidence that you'll perform later, but rather they're performed to kind of determine that you've got enough evidence to review, to assess the volume and type of evidence, to help you see what's been done before in terms of systematic reviews, but also empirical research, to help you refine your review question, make sure you're not duplicating anyone else's work, and identify key researchers working in your area. So scoping searches are the first sort of searches that you'll do. And they can be rough and ready. You can do them on Google Scholar or a database like Medline, but they're essentially designed to kind of get the lay of the land, figure out what do we know already about it. And there are some key sources that we recommend you search as part of scoping. So Prospero is a UK initiative that is a prospective international database for systematic reviews within health and social care. So Prospero will give you a flavour of ongoing or completed reviews within that field. Cochrane, again, an initiative that allows researchers to register protocols or completed reviews. So it's always worth searching Cochrane to make sure there isn't a Cochrane review ongoing in your area. And Epistemonicus is similar, so similar to Prospero. So that's the first thing to do. Double check that nobody is already doing a review in the area that you want to look at. And then, like I said, choose a topic relevant database and just do a simple search to see what's out there in terms of systematic reviews. Because you'll be surprised post-COVID as to how saturated the systematic review market is at the moment. So the first thing to do is to try and find that niche. And then what you need to do next is really think about the question that you want to ask. So there are a lot of different types of review question. That's quite well established. So there are descriptive questions that present a concept. There's normative questions that explore preferences about what should happen. Observational or relational questions that investigate the relationship between two or more variables. Causal questions that look to see, does change in X result in change in Y? And theoretical questions that explore factors that cause a condition, event, or process. And we really helpfully had some questions ahead of the webinar around kind of discipline-specific approaches to defining review questions. So thank you to those people that submitted those. Discipline-specific guidance tends to replicate well-established guidance, but may be applied with reference to a particular topic area. So, for example, the SALSA framework in environmental systematic reviews builds on the original SALSA framework with minimal adaptations, but gives examples of how this framework applies to ecosystem research. So it's always worth, when you're thinking about your question, taking a look to see if there's any discipline-specific guidance that may may just kind of give you some ideas about how to approach it from your particular lens. But regardless of your discipline, a good review question is clear, well-defined, appropriate, and manageable. And there are lots of question frameworks out there to help you structure your question. And PICO is a popular framework for clinical questions, especially those related to therapy, so kind of intervention effectiveness. And the PICO framework helps identify discrete and searchable aspects of a situation where a patient or population has a certain condition and the outcome of interest is related to a therapy or intervention. So PICO stands for population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. And there's an example on the screen there of how that's broken down for a particular review question. So that example there relates to the question, in older adults, is music therapy effective at reducing depression? There are lots and lots of different question frameworks. So in 2019, Andrew Booth wrote a really nice paper in the BMJ identifying 38 question frameworks. And I don't doubt that there's been more published since then. So take a look at that paper and just think about kind of what framework may lend itself best to your topic area or your specific question. So once you have a topic area in mind, you're confident there hasn't already been a review done in the area, and you've broken your question down in accordance with the framework, you want to think about inclusion-exclusion criteria. So these are criteria that define which studies are included in your review and which are excluded. And you'd normally develop these criteria after your review question's finalised, but before your search is carried out. But the question framework can really help to structure your eligibility criteria. So you want to really think about the reasoning behind some of these decisions. And common inclusion and exclusion criteria are outlined on this slide. They essentially kind of set the boundaries for your systematic review. So again, sort of thinking about topic area, you want to make sure that you're not making arbitrary decisions. So if you're saying, okay, I'm really interested in burnout in healthcare professionals, you may wish to limit to studies that were published post-pandemic, because you could hypothesize burnout may have altered, or the landscape of the healthcare systems may have changed post-pandemic. But you would need a good rationale for limiting your searches to only the last 5 years, for example. Similarly, you may have to make some pragmatic decisions. So if you only speak English and nobody on the review team speaks other languages, you may have to set English language only as an inclusion criteria. But you need to reflect on the potential limitations that will introduce into your review. So language bias would be an obvious one there. Similarly, with participants, you may say, okay, I'm interested in the views of adolescents. But you need to be really clear on what is an adolescent. And you'll find different definitions across studies. So are you looking at, I don't know, post-pubescent individuals? Are you setting an arbitrary 12 to 18? Does the definition of an adolescent change depending on country? So you need to really think through not just what those parameters will be, but how you may justify those parameters and the limitations of making those decisions. The inclusion and exclusion criteria allow you to control the volume of literature that you include in your review, but be careful, because if they're too narrow, you may end up with an empty review with no studies or very few studies. If they're too broad, you may end up with so many studies that you're overwhelmed. So development of your inclusion and exclusion criteria is very much guided by your scope of the literature, because that gives you a flavour of where research is being conducted, and therefore where you could narrow or widen some of those parameters. Okay. Once you have your question and associated inclusion and exclusion criteria, you need to write a review protocol. And a protocol essentially describes the thinking that has gone into your review question to date, outlines the methods that you will use to address your review question, and the projected timelines. And although this can be time consuming, it protects against bias and subjectivity creeping into your review later on in the decision-making stages. And importantly, it claims the review as well. So if you register your protocol on a database like Prospero, other researchers can see that you're doing it. And it doesn't completely guard against duplication, but it protects against it as much as you can. Okay. So the next stage in the review process is to then search for evidence. Okay, so this is the finding stage. And the aim of the systematic review search is to identify all relevant evidence on a specific research question in a comprehensive, transparent, and reproducible way. And I'm going to talk you through the different steps. So the first step is to think, what kind of evidence do I need to answer my question? And again, this is going to be quite discipline specific. I mostly conduct research in health and social care. So the bread and butter for us is peer-reviewed journal articles or unpublished dissertations, PhD theses. If you're in a different discipline, you may rely on different sources of evidence, so perhaps governmental reports, photographs, web pages. There's lots of different types of evidence. And Cochrane have a live list of sources that can be a really helpful place to start when thinking about the kind of data that you may need to help you answer your review question. But this is an essential first step, because once you know the kind of data you need, you can then search for it. So what we would recommend, first of all, is use your question framework to help you identify key concepts that you want to search for once you have an idea of the kind of evidence you want to search for. You might not need to search on every concept, but it helps to break your search down and think about, okay, how do I capture literature about older people and music therapy and depression or low mood? Okay. So we're going to use this as a worked example to illustrate how we may use our PICO framework to identify key concepts. Okay. So what you want to be doing here is thinking about the different ways that authors or producers of evidence may refer to the concepts that you're interested in. So you want to try and cast your net wide. So for example, we may use the language of older people or older adults. So they would be logical search terms to include. But depending on location or age of publication, you may also see terms like elderly, aged, senior citizen, old age, geriatric, pensioner. So you want to be thinking about all of the different possible terms people may use to refer to older adults. And then you want to do the same for music therapy. So yes, people may talk about music therapy, but they may talk about music as an intervention. They may talk about musical therapy or musically driven interventions. So you want to be comprehensive and inclusive. Same with your outcome. So again, depression is an obvious term to include. But then people may talk about depressed participants. They may talk about people who are low in mood, participants experiencing mood disorder or dysthymia. So you need to consider all of these different terms so that you don't miss papers. And people often say, well, how do I know? So first of all, think about all of the different ways you can think of to refer to these terms. And then have a look at the results from your scoping search and kind of say, okay, what are other people doing? How are other people referring to these constructs? What are other systematic reviews using the search terms? Even ask ChatGPT or another kind of generative AI, obviously checking accuracy. But sort of any way that you can to really think about comprehensive terms is helpful at this stage. And then you can whittle it down. Okay. So once you have all of your potential keywords, the next thing to do is try and combine them. And there are different ways of combining. So the word or allows you to retrieve records where one or more of your terms may be present. So you're saying essentially look for any record that includes the term older adult or pensioner or elderly or geriatric. So it increases the number of references you find, and it makes your search more sensitive. And kind of does the opposite. So and says, please find records where it contains the word older adult and music and depression. So it narrows down your search each time you use it and makes it smaller. So the trick here is to use the two to have a search that has an adequate balance of sensitivity and specificity. So what you want to do is you want to, so brackets keep everything together. So here we would say, okay, we want any record that contains any of the terms that we've identified people may use to refer to older adults, and any of the terms we've identified to refer to music therapy, and any of the terms that we've identified to refer to low mood. With the idea being that papers that refer to different combinations of these terms will all be captured in this search. And you may need to use a bit of trial and error, particularly if you've got lots and lots and lots of different synonyms or different constructs for the same concept, to make sure that your search is manageable. This is getting a little bit more complicated here, but essentially what you then want to do is think about how to translate your search to search the different databases that you identified early on. So different databases have different ways of categorizing or indexing studies. So if you think of a database as being a large repository of information, each database will have a specific focus. So something like Medline has a very medical focus. PsycInfo is much more psychology and sort of health and social care focused. So there's overlap between databases and commonality, but a lot of databases also have their own specific language. So what you want to do is make sure that your search is generic enough to translate across your databases, but also if you want to make it a bit fancier, if you want to make it a little bit more specific, you can use terms that are specific to certain databases to narrow it down further. So for example, if you're searching in an Ovid database, so Ovid kind of hosts things like Medline or PsycInfo, then you can use adjacency operators. So you can use ADJ3, for example, to say, I want you to find these two words within 3 of each other. So for example, adults who are older would be found with an ADJ if you have older and adults. If you're searching EBSCO, you can still use the same rule, but you need to use a different Boolean operator. So you need N, so near 3. It's all pretty complicated. It's not going to mean much to you if you're new to reviews, but the purpose of this slide is to really get you thinking about the different ways that databases sort of record or use information and the different ways you may need to translate your search. So have a look at YouTube. There's lots and lots of tutorials. Have a look at the help pages of different databases. Speak to a librarian. Be really diligent. Make sure you're checking your searches for errors. Ask for help, ask for support with this, because it is a really complex step. But it's really important in terms of making sure you're really transparent in your search for evidence. Okay. And make sure you save all of your searches, because you're going to need to report them in your review. You can then carry out supplementary searching. So you can look at the reference lists of relevant studies, relevant systematic reviews. You can also see which studies have gone on to cite seminal papers that you know are going to be included in your review, using citation searching on Web of Science or Scopus or Google Scholar. And these activities are typically referred to as hand searching. And make sure, like I said, you record your search strategy, because you're going to need to reproduce that in your review. And here you can see a pretty complicated set of search syntax, which is specific to Medline and uses lots of different sort of 2-letter clues to tell Medline what to do. So when I say kind of pilot your search across different databases and learn their language. It's because there's lots of smart things databases can do, but I could do a whole 2-hour webinar just on that, so I'll have to leave that there. Okay. So your next job, when you have run your searches, is to select relevant studies for inclusion in your review. And you only want to include in your review studies which meet all of your inclusion criteria and none of your exclusion criteria. So you want to filter out irrelevant studies and include the ones that are relevant to your review question. And there are 2 stages that you can use to do this. So the first stage is to screen the titles and abstracts of the results of your searches, with the aim being to exclude clearly irrelevant citations. And then screen the full text papers of potentially relevant studies, with the aim being to include relevant studies. And it's best practice for 2 people to independently do each of these stages to reduce bias. And you need to keep really clear records, because you'll be expected to record and report the results of your search and of searching for evidence. Okay. So how do you do this? First of all, you need to deduplicate your references. So as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of overlap among databases. So whilst you may have several thousand results from your database searches, when you combine them, that's going to reduce because of duplicates. So take out any duplicate references, and then you want to screen all titles and abstracts, obtain potentially eligible references, and do it all again, but with the full text. And there are tools like Rayan, Covidence, EpiReviewer that can help you with this step, help you to organise and sort of share study abstracts among reviewers. You will need to record this in your review, and most journals mandate use of PRISMA guidance. We've included a couple of links there to the PRISMA statement and flow diagram, and here's an example of the PRISMA flow diagram that breaks down the results of that study screening and selection from initial searches right through to included studies. And there's an app that comes along with that as well, which we've included the link to. I'm aware I'm whizzing through this, but it's because there's so much to cover. So if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. So once you have your final studies for inclusion, the next step is to extract relevant data. So this is the describing stage. So first of all, you want to think about which data will allow me to answer my review question, because all of your studies are going to contain lots of relevant data, but also lots of irrelevant data. So you want to think, what do I need to answer my review question? And what data may I need to contextualize the results and allow comparison within and between studies? Okay. So you may wish to extract the following descriptive data. So things like study design, inclusion exclusion criteria, participants, details of any intervention, any outcomes, analyses undertaken, and any kind of conflict of interest or funding. And then you likely will need some analytical data as well. So if you're doing a review of quantitative evidence, you may wish to have summary data, effect sizes, measures of statistical significance. If you're doing a review of qual evidence, you might want qualitative themes, first or second order quotations or interpretations. And there's an example here of a template. So what we would recommend is that you make a list of the data you wish to extract, operationalize that in a standard template like this, and then apply that template to each of your included studies to make sure that you're being consistent in the data that you extract. And if a study doesn't report that, you can either contact the authors to ask for clarification or say that it's not reported. So it's not enough just to take out data. You also need to look at the quality of individual studies, because quality assessment allows you to determine how robust the methods are and therefore how trustworthy findings are. And it's really important to think about this rather than just assume that every study is equally as good as every other study. Okay. And there are lots of different tools that will help you to assess the quality of included studies. But what you want to be thinking about essentially is how robust are the methods that the authors have used? How generalizable or externally valid are the findings? And are there any sort of external sources of bias, like funding bias, that may have made researchers report certain findings over others? And again, there are lots of tools available to help with quality assessment, and we've put a couple of examples up there. But it's really important to make sure that your tool fits your study design. So please don't confuse quality assessment tools with tools for reporting the quality of reporting of a study. And one of the common errors we see with quality assessment tools is the selection of the wrong tool. So most often it's because people have selected one that assesses the quality of the not one that assesses the quality of the methods, but the quality of the reporting. So please don't use tools like the Consort Statement Trials, Strobe for observational studies, Prisma for systematic reviews, as they're all tools that guide the authors when reporting the study, not when conducting the study. You may commonly see tools like the CASP checklist used, the risk of bias too. So loads of them. And again, we've linked to some sources here to help you identify the right tool for your review. The final step, once you've extracted relevant data and looked at the quality or trustworthiness of those data, is to bring it all together. And again, there are different ways that you can do this, and it will be very much dependent on the review question that you're answering and the data that you have. So if you're doing a review of quantitative evidence, there are broadly two different ways to synthesize your results. You can do a narrative synthesis, so using text to describe the overall effect, noting variations as a function of study characteristics, implementation, quality, and so on. Or you could do a meta-analysis, which is a statistical method of combining the results from studies included in your review and looking at standardized effect sizes to get an overall effect size. And meta-analysis is often well suited to reviews of evidence from clinical trials rather than social science studies. But so long as your data satisfy assumptions of heterogeneity and so on, then you may be able to meta-analyze them. If you're doing a review of qualitative evidence, then there are lots of different methods to synthesize qual data, depending on whether it's inductive or deductive, it's aggregative or interpretative, it's theory generating or theory testing. So again, lots of sort of decisions to be made there. And then finally, you may be synthesizing qual and quant data together. So again, there's additional considerations there. And again, in the chat, we had the pre-webinar chat, we had some questions about different software that may help. And there's loads. There's R, there's Stata, there's JASP, there's Jamovi, Meta Essentials, Meta Excel, Meta Easy. So all of these are really useful packages if you want to do a meta-analysis. Some are free, some aren't. So have a little read around software packages if that's something you're considering. Okay. So like I mentioned, narrative synthesis is commonly done in the absence of data that are suitable for meta-analysis. But it's not just a summary of the data in your data tables, but rather it's a critical interpretation of the findings of your included studies, taking into account risk of bias and quality. And there's two stages. So first of all, you would describe the studies, and then you would bring those findings together in a synthesis that critically looks at how trustworthy your findings are. And there are different ways. You can group results for reporting by population or by outcome, and look at how many studies report on each grouping, how many found a positive or negative or no effect. Look at the statistical significance of the results in the context of sample size, and so on. Or you can report your results as a whole, but it's generally preferable to group studies to report, just for clarity. When it comes to reporting a systematic review, there's lots of guidance, and I alluded to that earlier when I said don't fall in the trap of using reporting guidance to look at quality. You'll be really familiar when you start delving into systematic review literature with Prisma, and we've touched upon that already. But there's lots of other reporting guidelines. So if you're looking at doing a review of interventions, but your data aren't suitable for meta-analysis, then the SWIM guidance is really nice. So that's synthesis without meta-analysis guidance. But there's lots of other guidance. So NTRAC is for qualitative reviews, there's MOOS, there's loads out there. And it's helpful in terms of knowing what you need to include in your write-up and where and when. Okay, so we're coming towards the end. This is a slide that we added in post hoc, again, as a result of the questions that people asked, so thank you. There's a lot of debate at the moment about artificial intelligence and systematic reviews, how and if it should be used, and I guess sort of the ethical considerations associated with that. And you're not unique in raising these concerns. They're things that are being hotly debated in the evidence synthesis sphere at the moment. And Cochrane have put out recommendations and guidance on responsible AI in evidence synthesis and ways to use AI in evidence synthesis. And at the moment, responsible use of AI guidance are being prepared. And again, we've included the link there. So what we would say is if you want to use AI, please familiarise yourself with these guidance. But importantly, please also check your institutional policy around the use of AI in relation to writing systematic reviews, particularly if you plan to submit as part of an academic course or module or qualification. And if you're looking to publish your review, please check the AI policy of the journal you will plan to submit to before you start, just to sort of check the parameters of what's permitted there as well. Okay, so we've come to the end. I'm amazed I've done this in 40 minutes because I thought I would be a good couple of hours, so forgive me for having whizzed through this. If you would like to sort of join our mailing list to receive details about the new edition of our book and any other event, please drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you, and we can keep you up to date with any developments. So I'll stop talking now. I'll have a well-earned drink and I'll sort of hand the floor back to Pia for any questions, but thank you.
Yes, well, very well done on doing all of that in under 40 minutes. That is incredible. And thanks everyone for engaging in the chat and the Q&A. I can see we had loads of questions and loads of comments, so that's really great. So let me just find, I have selected, I started just collating some of the questions during the presentation. Someone asked, can you discuss the time commitment required for systematic reviews in team sizes? Is this something one can do solo? Oh, you're on mute.
I was doing so well. That's such a good question. I'm really glad you've asked that. So the answer is going to be, it depends. You can, in theory, do a systematic review solo, but it raises the question of should you do a systematic review solo? So if you have absolutely no choice and you're doing a review as part of an academic qualification, for example, you may have to work alone. And what we would say is best practices for reviews to be done by a team or at least two people, because it reduces the risk of bias creeping in at different stages. So when I presented the list of the different steps involved in doing a review, there's always the potential for bias to creep in. And it can creep in sort of inadvertently. You may think that you're applying your inclusion criteria in a certain way, but there may be ambiguity there. So we would always say, if possible, have somebody else involved in those key methodological decisions. So things like screening, selection, data extraction, quality assessment. If you can't have anyone else involved for whatever reason, be your own independent checker. So kind of do the screening, put it aside, redo it, check that you haven't missed anything, and acknowledge the limitation of that in your write-up. I've worked in systematic review teams where we've included sort of dozens of people. The largest review I've done was a review of 498 studies. That took us years. I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you're paid to do it and you can cope with it, because it really broke me. Most reviews, I would say, are kind of moderate size, so perhaps anywhere from 10 to 30 studies. The time commitment will really depend on the amount of studies that you include in your review. So it's really tricky to give a clearly defined answer. But what you want to make sure is that your review isn't out of date. So don't have it so big that it takes you 2 years to do it, so that by the time you publish it, your searches are out of date. So you need to think really pragmatically about the time and the resources that are available to you before you start.
Thank you. That is a great answer. Talking about timing, there was a question about how often is systematic reviews needed for a certain topic? Say, if someone has done a systematic review on a topic 5 years ago, would journals appreciate someone doing it again?
Again, it's a really good question. And it's actually one that came up in clinical supervision today with one of my research students. And so our kind of informal policy on our programme is, if you're doing a systematic review for an academic accreditation, you'll need to demonstrate independence of thought. So replicating an existing review without a really clear rationale for expecting differences or changes to the results, just because a period of time has passed, we would say isn't a strong enough justification for doing so. That said, if you anticipate that the findings would be different, so if a large body of literature has been published since a previous review, if, for example, there's been a change in policy, or obviously something like COVID that has resulted in a change in practice, then absolutely there could well be the need for an update. So I think it's very topic specific, area specific, development specific, but you would need to make a case beyond it's been 5 years as to why an updated review is needed in this space rather than a review of something different.
That makes sense. Someone had asked, how do you visualize your review for gaps?
Ooh, that's a good question. So what I would be interested in there is what is meant by gaps. So I don't know if I'm allowed to ask for more information from that person or whether they'd prefer to
Yes.
share it written, but yeah, and so that would be my first question. What do you mean by gaps? I guess sort of if you're thinking about sort of taking an inequalities lens and looking to see actually who's represented in a review, there's things like Progress Plus that will allow you to look at inequalities within a systematic review and really allow you to highlight who's not represented as well as who is, which can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Sometimes, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say I couldn't really see who had asked the question. I couldn't find it anymore in the Q&A. So if you'd like to clarify in the chat what you meant, then we can go back to the question.
Thank you. But yeah, I guess sort of without that context, I think for me, I would be thinking about how, so one aspect of quality assessment will be how representative are these people of the part of the population in general that are affected by this condition or this phenomena. So what I would hope is that your quality assessment would allow you to start to unpick a little bit. Actually, are we studying only well-educated, middle-aged females, when actually this is a disease that affects predominantly older males from socioeconomically deprived areas? So that would be picked up partially in your quality assessment. But it's always helpful when you're writing a discussion to think about who isn't represented as well as who is, and really highlight that as a gap.
Yeah, that sounds good. Someone had asked whether you would recommend using librarians to help with developing and running the search, and at what point would you involve librarians in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of my most invaluable colleagues are information specialists. Michelle's an information specialist herself, so it's unfortunate that she's not able to attend today. But yeah, we would always recommend a librarian or information specialist support if you have one. Um, when it comes to what stage, I think that really depends. So it's often really helpful to be able to go to an expert in database searching when you've thought about different synonyms for your concept and you've started to combine them. Because what a librarian or information specialist will be able to do is translate that search in different ways to different databases. What perhaps may be outside of their remit is some of that topic specific knowledge. So I wouldn't go to a librarian and say, oh, I'm a bit stuck on different synonyms for older adults. What I would say is, here are my search terms. Can you help me optimize them for different databases and ensure that I'm using syntax that allows these papers to be picked up? So yeah, that's when I would approach them, at the point of having thought about synonyms and constructs and when you're trying to translate or apply that to database searches.
Perfect. Someone said they recently returned an empty systematic review, even though the question was well formed. How often does this happen, and do you think it's still a relevant finding?
Yes, absolutely. So we've actually just submitted an empty systematic review for publication because it was a grant funded study and we anticipated finding literature to answer our question, which was around the effectiveness of interventions for people experiencing recurrent miscarriage. And the fact that there wasn't anything there felt so important to highlight because I think sort of researchers, clinicians, practitioners work on the assumption that, well, this has been studied, but actually, if you're systematically searching for evidence that's not there, you need to highlight that. You need to kind of say, look, this is what's needed, and really make it clear in which direction you think that research literature needs to move in order to have the evidence that we need to make decisions. So yeah, I fully advocate.
And I guess on a similar note, someone asked, how many studies are deemed sufficient for a systematic review? I once found only 13 studies in my topic of interest.
So again, it's another frustrating answer of it depends. So what we say to our students is if you're submitting a review as part of an academic qualification or accreditation, you're going to be examined on your ability not just to identify studies, but to critically appraise, extract data, synthesize. And paradoxically, it can be much harder to synthesize 2 or 3 studies together than it can to synthesize more studies. So we say to our students, informally, a minimum of 10 studies is sufficient to be able to demonstrate the attributes that you're going to be examined on. If you're a doctoral student and you're trying to make the case for a research question being novel and under-researched, then the purpose of your review shifts slightly, and you're doing a review to evidence the lack of knowledge or lack of evidence in the area, rather than synthesize what's already known. So it would be permissible to do a review with fewer or even no studies to justify the need for your empirical study. If you're applying for a review as part of a larger grant, then you need to again be thinking about the purpose of the review. And if the purpose is to inform a subsequent work package by synthesizing what's already known, then you need to be confident that there's enough out there. So again, I'd work on the rule of 10 as a minimum. But again, being careful that you're looking at, you're not just using that as an arbitrary thing. So if you're combining qualitative and quantitative data, for example, it wouldn't be meaningful to have 5 qual studies, 5 quant studies if you're doing a multi-methods review and analysing those separately. So you've got to look at it in the context of your review.
Great. In terms of databases, someone asked, should you be searching multiple databases? I am told some are better than others.
Yeah. So again, yes, best practice is to search multiple databases, but the exact databases that you search will depend on your review question. So with me working in sort of health and social care, if I'm doing a clinical psychology focused question of qualitative evidence, what I will normally do is search the key players, so I'll search Medline, I'll search PsycInfo, I'll probably search something like Embase or Web of Science, but then I'll search CINAHL because that's Index Qualitative Studies for Longest. So I've got the best chance of finding older qualitative literature there. So you want to be searching enough databases for a comprehensive coverage of your topic, but not so many that you're just searching for searching's sake. So the reviews I do, I normally search 5 to 7. Some reviews are bigger, some reviews are smaller, but definitely multiple databases will be expected.
And then when it comes to publishing, someone has asked, is one type of review more likely to be published? For example, does a systematic review have better chances than a scoping review?
Again, it really depends on the purpose of the review. So scoping reviews can be really valuable in terms of mapping where things are up to and giving a really broad overview of a topic area. And certainly publishable, I published a number of them myself. Systematic reviews provide a much more rigorous and transparent answer to a more narrow and focused question. So I think, yeah, it goes back to why are you doing the review and what audience are you intending to benefit from the review. But no, I certainly wouldn't say one's more publishable than the other. I think they're both equally publishable if done right.
I'm just going through some of the questions. Sorry, we had so many questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to be able to answer them all. So I'm trying to find the ones that might be relevant to everyone. Someone asked, the lines are sometimes blurred between systematic and scoping reviews, especially when it comes to the research questions. Would you say the following question is more suitable for scoping or systematic review? What can we learn from top psychology journals about fraud?
So I would say, putting me completely on the spot, I would say that perhaps that question needs to be a little narrower. So if it was a systematic review question, thinking again about those different types of questions that I presented on an earlier slide, I'd perhaps be thinking about trying to either quantify or qualitize that question in some way. So for example, looking across at correlates or predictors of fraud published in psychology journals, or thinking about participants' experiences of being involved in fraud. If you're doing a scoping review, then you could be broader in your question, but I think you would still need a more focused question to allow you to explore that in a meaningful way. So for example, I can't think now. I've been put on the spot, but I think I would find it really hard to do a review with such a kind of a broad question, whether it's scoping or systematic.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think we have time for one more question. Someone asked, at times relevant materials for the review are not accessible, so can one use open access material only in a systematic review? And how would this affect the quality of the study?
No, so yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that is frustrating because there are so many journals that are behind paywalls. Less so now with the advent of open access, but certainly, even going back 10 years, there's a lot of subscriber only. So there's different ways to approach this. So the first is to think about, is there any way you can become affiliated with an institution that subscribes to some of these? Either a university, through collaboration, through healthcare providers, but some way of kind of accessing. Or could you work with someone that can access them? If you can't, or if your institution doesn't subscribe, then there are other ways to potentially seek the full text of papers that are behind paywalls. So sites such as ResearchGate allow authors to upload the full text of papers, and you can contact authors and ask them for a full text of papers, even if they haven't uploaded it. All papers should have a corresponding author, so you can contact them as well and ask them to send you the PDF of their paper. You don't always get a response, but often you do. You could include only the abstract, so data from the abstract, but acknowledging that as a limitation. You can request papers. So if your institution doesn't have it, the British Library, for example, will give you an interlibrary loan and will send you things that they subscribe to for a small fee. What else can you do? I mean, if you're absolutely limited to open access only, you can still do a review, but you would need to really highlight that as a limitation. And it kind of feeds into that whole sort of authors that can afford to pay or are affiliated with institutions that can afford to pay are more likely. So it is quite a big limitation, but not insurmountable.
Yeah, thank you. On that note, I think we're gonna have to stop here. We are at time. Thank you so much, Gemma, for your time, and Michelle as well in absence, and everyone who joined and asked questions and engaged. We will be sending out the recording and additional resources in the next few days, so look out for an email from us. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone and hope to see you soon. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you all so much. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.